So look, in this video, I'm going to break down the number one reason why you're stuck with slow and steady podcast growth and can't seem to break through. How a podcaster called Jake was able to grow past 300,000 monthly listens within 9 months without social media, big guests, or a following prior to launching the show. And finally, I'm going to break down one simple hack that you can start doing today in order to rank higher on Apple and Spotify, reach significantly more listeners, and stop feeling invisible every time you post a content. Look, this is specifically for business owners and experts who are in a place where you've been podcasting for more than 6 months, maybe a year, maybe even 2 years, maybe even 3 years with your show. You're making good content, having great conversations, but every time you upload your episodes, your reach basically stays the same. If anything, it might be decreasing. And look, the main reason why this happens isn't because your content isn't good enough. It's not because the guests aren't promoting your podcast and sharing it to more people. It's not because your clips aren't going viral and attracting a whole new audience into the show. It's simply because the fact that you don't understand how podcasts actually grow. Now, I know that might be a bit of a blow to the ego, to the mind, but that's the truth that I found out after interviewing and coaching 400 plus business owners with shows, is they fundamentally don't understand how podcast actually grows. They don't understand, and you likely don't understand, how listeners actually discover podcasts. If you understood how listeners discover podcasts, then you would simply place yourself in the place where listeners discover podcasts, and your podcast will be blowing up. Your inbox will be filled with a bunch of fan mails of people who love your show and rave about the content you produce. And you'll be constantly flooded and inundated with people begging you to sell them stuff because they want to work with you. Now, if that's not happening and you've had a podcast and you're not reaching more listeners and you're barely getting any engagement on your show, is because you fundamentally don't understand how listeners actually find podcasts. Now look, for the longest time, me and Ty, we also struggled to really understand how listeners find shows. And we would focus in on social media promotions, which never worked to help our clients grow. We're focusing on having great conversations with guests, posting on social media, and all these crazy strategies, but those things didn't work. The results were inconsistent, and even when they did grow, we didn't really understand why. And it wasn't until we found a guy called Jake Ward who grew his podcast past 300,000 monthly downloads in 9 months, which is still to this day absolutely bonkers, insane. And he did it, to top it off, he did it without posting a single time on social media, without having guests. He had actually a solo podcast, and he didn't have a big following before he launched. And we asked him, hey, how the hell did you grow? And he shared very openly with us, he used podcast SEO to grow his show. He got his podcast ranked on page 1 of Apple and Spotify, which is the number 1 platform new listeners go to find new shows. And as a result of him ranking on page 1, for the main keywords, the main search terms his audience would use to find a podcast like his, which is all about sleep, it meant that he had thousands of people discovering his podcast every single day because he was leveraging Apple and Spotify, which is the platforms people go to discover shows to listen to. So the question then becomes, well, if the way people find podcasts is through Apple and Spotify, and they basically just go on there and they either search, mainly they'll search specific keywords like how to reduce anxiety, how to improve my sleep, how to be a better first-time vegan, how to grow a podcast, how to invest and make more money. They'll type in essentially problems they're going through, looking for solutions. Now, the key here is, if you want to be discovered, you need to identify and find out what are the specific search terms that your audience and listeners will type in on Apple and Spotify to find a show like yours. So for example, Jake, who I spoke about, who grew his podcast past 300,000 monthly listens, his keywords were basically better sleep. That was basically it. Now, what you do from this point on, once you identify the keywords your audience would use to find a show like yours, is every episode you put out, you literally add those keywords to your titles. You also add them to your show name. You add them to your show notes. You add them everywhere you possibly can. This will do is it gives Apple and Spotify the information they need in order to show your podcast to the right listener. That's it. So if you want to grow your podcast, grow your reach, have way more people reaching out to you to work with you, not just your guests, but actual listeners consistently reaching out to you, and you attracting more monetization opportunities into your business, whether that's through sponsorship or whether that's through listeners reaching out because they want to join your program and buy your products. The way to do that is by getting your show ranked on Apple and Spotify. And you get your show ranked on Apple and Spotify on page 1 by asking yourself the simple question: what are the search terms, the keywords that I need to add in every single episode I release in order to rank high on Apple and Spotify? So when a new listener looks for my content, they find me. Right now, the reason you're not growing is because when someone searches in those keywords, your podcast is invisible. They go looking for how to reduce anxiety. Let's say, for example, it's all about that. They don't find you. And this is exactly what happened to one of our clients, Christy, who was managing the podcast Anxiety at Work. For the longest time, 2 years actually, they were posting great content, having high profile guests onto their show. One of the guys had hundreds of thousands of followers on LinkedIn, promoted all day long, but no one ever actually went through and listened to a show. But it wasn't until we fixed this podcast SEO that their listenership more than doubled within 90 days of implementing this strategy, because they were finally visible when people searched in anxiety at work in relation to their area of expertise. You need to do the same. And until you figure that piece out, what keywords to target, and then adding them consistently to your episode titles, I promise you, growing a show will continue to feel like this uphill battle, but it doesn't need to. So this is my massive encouragement to you to start focusing on podcast SEO, ranking high on Apple and Spotify, to grow your visibility, to reach significantly more listeners, and to not feel frustrated and pissed off because you're putting all this time and energy into a podcast that isn't being found, that isn't reaching more people, and that doesn't feel like it's actually giving you an ROI for the time you're investing in. So that being said, I'll catch you in the next video.